as you know, our topic is the modern Navy and globalization. I think it's a wonderful topic. The question of globalization itself is fascinating. What are the implications of that? And what are the implications for the Navy and its missions in the future? Undersecretary Hultin is a 1972 Yale Law School graduate and has been at Washington, or was a Washington lawyer for a quarter of a century and business consultant. He was appointed in 1993 to the board of directors of the Federal Home Loan Mortgage Association, and was also made a member in 1994 of the Chief of Naval Operations Executive Panel, which does a lot of interesting studies on nearly all of the questions pertaining to the Navy. It gets involved in their quadrennial review and deals with questions of mission and purpose, which had to have been a fascinating period of time. And in 1997 was appointed to his current position as Undersecretary of the Navy. When Ambassador Johnston here was here the other day, he read, for those of you who were here, he referred to the three-part definition of his job at State. And the first question he was asked at the briefing was, what does the Secretary do? And in reading the Undersecretary's job description, I had the same kind of question going through my mind, except it clearly said that he reported directly to the Secretary in all of these things. But the areas to which he has to pay attention are important. They involve the basic roles of the Navy as well as the support of the institution. It's a fascinating topic. We look forward to it very much. It's my pleasure to present to you Undersecretary of the Navy, Hultin.
Thank you, Frank, for that kind introduction. I will make one correction, though. I was not a Washington lawyer for 25 years. I was an Ohio lawyer for 25 years and came to Washington in '93. As you'll see as I talk about the sort of role of the heartland in some of these issues, that a good bit of my heart still remains back in the Midwest. So it's also good to be here because one of my dearest friends, Robbie Harris, is the one that invited me or offered the chance to do this, and also Mike Hughes, both from Lockheed. But Robbie Harris was the head of the chief of staff of the CNO's executive panel in the years that I served, and we became dear friends since then. And he couldn't be here tonight, but he's one of your members, and I want to thank Lockheed and Robbie and Mike for all you've done. The job of being undersecretary is fun, but one of the nice things is I am a young naval officer, was a young naval officer. Went to Ohio State, got commissioned in '64, and found myself almost immediately in the South China Sea on a destroyer. Summer of '64, as you recall, was the summer of the Gulf of Tonkin incidents, and by the first incident I was in Hong Kong. By the second incident I was in the South China Sea with the Maddox and the Turner Joy, about 30 miles away. Two interesting stories. One is, we're in Hong Kong, and we'd rented a suite in a hotel, somewhat like this, had a room high up, and the whole wardroom had done this, and we used it as a place to sort of meet and rendezvous. And I was walking the street, ran into a fellow officer, says, something's happened, we gotta go back to the hotel, the Hilton. So we go back to the Hilton, and inside the captain's sitting there looking very serious, and he says, I can't talk about this. Something's happened. Return to the ship in random order so no one knows anything's up. So this is pretty exciting for a young naval officer. So we wait, and it comes my turn to leave, so I go out trying to be kind of casual through the lobby, and Chinese bellboy comes up and says, must return to ship immediately. Important problem in South China Sea. So he knew everything, and we knew nothing. Well, then I get out, and after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and you recall, there was a fair amount of controversy about what happened, especially on the second incident. And even that night, we all thought nothing had happened, but no one asked, so life went on. We did the raid on Hanoi the next day, and to just show you the consequences of life. Lieutenant Alvarez was a pilot in that raid. He was shot down, put in prison camp. In prison camp, my whole naval career, 5 years, my whole time at Yale to become a lawyer, 8 years before he's released. So there's a man that for the whole time of what I view as the formative years of my life is in prison camp. And you meet Mr. Alvarez now, and you are impressed with his good humor, his sort of love of life, maybe a reason for that, but it's quite marvelous and amazing what those men did in those circumstances. Well, anyway, after the Gulf of Tonkin incident and the raid of Hanoi, our ship got given some independent duty, and we were just sailing forever in the South China Sea, and it's a hot sea. Someone here was on the South China Sea, and we were talking tonight, but it's hot in the summer and boring. So finally, the captain says one day, he says, Hultin, he says, have a casino night. Well, I grew up in Michigan, so I know how to play poker, and that's about my limit of gambling. So get out a little book, and we can barely read what looks like how to set up a craps table and how to do blackjacks and things like that. Set up casino night on the mess deck. Go up on watch, 2000, 8 o'clock watch, it's dark. Carrier launches an aircraft. Aircraft takes off, comes up to do what they call cap above us, and says, I'm going to drop a couple flares, see what's going on. So we wait. Nothing happens. Phone rings. It's the mess decks. They say, Ensign Hultin, you got a problem. What's that? Well, you got the odds wrong on the craps table. The Chiefs know it. They've been betting hard, and they're $1,000 ahead. I'm supposed to be making money for charity with this operation. Well, ensigns in those days make about $2,000 a year, so $1,000 out of my pocket is going to be a real problem. So I say, well, I don't know what I'm going to do. I hang up. So now where's this jet? Nothing happens. So I mull things over. Fine. I got an idea. I call back up the mess deck. Say, look, we using money down there, or are we using script? You know, dollar bills or paper money? Well, it's Vietnam. We're using script. I says, okay, got the solution. Devalue the currency. So I devalue the currency about 100 to 1, get myself down to a debt I can handle, and shut down the craps table. Meanwhile, up on the bridge, still waiting to see what happens, the pilot of the jet says, he says, you know what? He says, I think they misracked the bombs and the flares, meaning he's dropped the bombs on us. Well, two things to take from this story. One is the Navy of today is a far kinder and gentler place than someone who would devalue the currency and take money from the pockets of chiefs. Secondly, it's also a more precise place, and had that precision existed in 1964, I wouldn't be here to speak to you tonight. They would have hit us with those bombs. Out of it, although you may ask the question, how could this person live on a destroyer after he'd taken $1,000 from the chiefs? And I think that's why they decided maybe I was qualified to be undersecretary, that anyone that could cut the budget that hard and live was worth talking to. Well, I could tell sea stories all night, and you'd say enough. So let me move into the brave topics that I laid out to discuss tonight and discuss with you. And I think we should be able to do this in a way that both I can put some ideas on the table, and then you all can really work with me on these ideas. Three things I want to talk about tonight. First is about the Navy of today, and I really want to emphasize 2 or 3 points. One is its net-centric quality, and I'll tell you a little more what that means. Its precision, and also what the Marines have done. And remember, I'm the Secretary or Undersecretary of the Navy. I have 2 services underneath me, the Navy and the Marine Corps. Talk about what the Marines have done in this new world. Then secondly, I want to talk about globalization, to at least put some ideas on the table. And third, I want to talk about a theme that I especially pursue when I'm with people around the nation, whether they're school teachers or bankers or Wall Street executives or you, and that is the role that we all play in making America a vital, innovative society, and why that's so important to us as defenders of the nation. But first, let's talk about the Navy, and precision especially. You've probably noticed we have more and more understood since the end of the Cold War that we are a forward force engaged all the time. We deploy 6 months at a time. We essentially do our work at the front edge of the spear, more and more up against the coast. If you look at Kosovo, you begin to see some of the attributes of what this means. You first thought about Kosovo, this is an Air Force action, right? We saw bombers being flown from Kansas all the ways to Kosovo and back. A marvelous and quite amazing mission. But if you look more closely at Kosovo, what you see is this. The first part of the war is a naval war because we're the ones from destroyers and submarines and from carriers launching aircraft that take down the air defense systems. It's predominantly a naval operation. Why? Because we're there. We have precise weapons to take care of this, and we can do it from multiple sources. And then not only that, but it was less known, but we flew an electronic warfare plane with every mission that was flown into Kosovo, and those were all naval assets being used. So while Kosovo to many looked like an Air Force operation, the Navy was deeply engaged. And in addition to that, as soon as we were at the point where the Marines were needed ashore, you saw us land the Marines within 24 hours, have them deployed where we needed them, do their work in a way that I think is quite marvelous, and I'll discuss that a little more. But let's talk a little bit about precision and what it means for the future of warfare. We now have the ability, as I told the bankers of the nation in Phoenix, to essentially bring a Tomahawk missile in that window, or this window, or this window at our choice. It can have profound differences. If this were a power plant, those could be the switches which run the power plant. Those could be the turbines. If you hit the switches, you're shut down for 2 weeks. If you hit the turbines, you're shut down for 2 years. What do you want to accomplish? If you want to disable the nation for a short while in order to topple the leader, perhaps the switches. If you want to send a mark to a nation that you view their essence as detrimental, you shut down the turbines. Well, you have those choices. Choices are quite powerful. They now mean you know what you're hitting, therefore you are accountable and responsible. Think about that. Why was our missile into the Chinese embassy such a problem? It wasn't a problem for my father as a bomber pilot in World War II. As he flew into Germany and dropped bombs, if the bombs missed the target, no one said, intentionally hit that piece of a German city. Said, of course, bombs are imprecise. They land where they might. It's very difficult to get them where you want. But now we can hit exactly where we want to be. So we're also responsible. In addition, we now need to know far much more. In the case of the Chinese embassy, part of the problem was that the streets were numbered differently than we were used to. You didn't number buildings sequentially up the road. You numbered them serially based on when you built them. So we made an assumption about the numbers that turned out not to be true. So you can see the great increase that precision brings, not only in your capability, but in what you have to know and what you intend to do. Now, we also thought about it some more and said to ourselves, you know, if we have, let's say, 400 power plant targets in a country, perhaps there's some which are more important than others. Can we identify those, the sort of nodes where everything crosses? And if you hit that node, the whole grid falls. Well, in fact, you can figure that out. And once figured out, you can now say instead of 400 targets, perhaps I have 40 I need to hit. And if you only need to hit 40, now think of the consequences. Instead of 400 missions with pilots at risk, 40. Instead of 400 missiles shot at $1 million apiece, 40. The numbers change, the risks change, and yet you can have the same consequence. And you ask yourself, if you can hit power plants, well, perhaps you ought to hit the phone system, maybe more important to the ability of the country to survive. And if you can hit the phone system, perhaps you want to hit the banking system, because that's really what draws the country together. And perhaps if you can hit the banking system, you want to hit the cronies of the despot, because they're the ones skimming the money out of industry, stealing basically to keep the despot alive. If you can find those despots and hit them, maybe you end the war in essence like that and end the will to fight. Well, as I walked you up that ladder, though, I've walked you well past what we now view as moral warfare. We're very close to the edge of what we would call assassination, which we have tried to avoid. So you can see with precision not only comes much greater opportunity, much greater ability to influence events, but also real questions for us is how we want to fight. And you're probably thinking the other question which often comes to mind, which is, well, if you can do that so surgically, so without anyone put at risk, have we really invested in that war the way that people expected us to? Have we made the commitment of resources? Interesting moral dilemma. I would argue at one level, to not put our soldiers and sailors at risk is the essence of what we ought to do to win. And therefore, the more surgical, the better. And if we can accomplish that, that's what we should do. But you hear an interesting argument waged around the world that we are taking advantage of our wealth to fight wars this way. Well, I'm not going to give answers to all those questions, but to say that's what precision brings to us, and it's fairly profound change in what warfare could look like. Now, the other thing that's interesting to talk about is the Marines. The Marines have taken a view now that they will fight a three-block war. And they mean by three-block war this. On one block, I will be a war fighter. On one block, I'll be a peacemaker. And on one block, I'll be a humanitarian. And they've trained their sergeants and their corporals to have the judgment, the capacity, the nuance, not a word we always associated with the Marine Corps of the past, to do these things in simultaneous time. That is, to do that as you walk 3 blocks through the city. It's as though you were coming down this street and change your obligation block by block. And in fact, if you look at what we did in Kosovo, we did that in 1 block. You would see a young Marine, 19, 20 years old, M16 over the shoulder looking for snipers. Someone walks by, says, "You're going to be the tax collector, the peacemaker." And underneath his arm, he's got a young child, and he's looking for food, the humanitarian. And these young men and women were able to do this, and the Army followed on our heels with great composure, with great nuance, with great discerning of what was the right thing to do. That's a fairly profound shift in war fighting as you and I might think of it from World War II, or even from Vietnam, where the issue of whether our only obligation was winning the war militarily, or was our obligation something related to the peacemaking and humanitarian qualities of that society. So you can see Navy and Marine Corps power going through significant changes coming out of the Cold War. No blue water navies to fight, no grand and glorious battles like Midway and others on the horizon. More and more up against the shore, more and more dirty, confusing, high risk, and messy. We've also attempted to change our ships. We have a new generation of ships on the drawing boards. We'll be here at about 2008, in which we will try to have stealth on our ships, in which we'll try to reduce the crew from 300 to 100 per destroyer. Fewer lives at risk, fewer sailors to recruit, and hopefully people trained well to maintain that ship at that capacity. Another profound revolution. All this we sum up at times, in the words of the Chief of Naval Operations, Jay Johnson, as we will have the ability to decisively influence events ashore, anywhere, anytime. Fairly audacious statement by a naval power. Typically, naval powers did their influencing at sea, let the Army take care of the shore. We now have Tomahawk missiles that go 1,000 miles inland. We're basically able to get to almost all of the world from our coastal positions around the world, except deepest Siberia. So all the world we can influence. Understanding how to influence it and do it is still a big piece of our agenda as we move into the future. Now, there's one other piece I want to mention about the Navy and Marine Corps, and then I'll move on to globalization. And that is this. We're a big business in many ways. $90 billion a year of money, 800,000 people. enterprises around the world going on all the time we speak. And yet, when I arrived after being a lawyer, businessman, investment banker, said to myself, this is not a modern run business. We are using, in many ways, the artifacts of the 60s, the McNamara budgeting system, the artifacts of the Cold War, a long budgeting cycle when we have enemies that have no budgets at all and certainly no budget cycle to worry about. And we are building ourselves almost a Maginot Line of burden that will keep us from responding to the threats we face. And I've argued inside the Pentagon often that unless we become competitive, unless we become business-oriented, unless we begin to use private sector techniques, we will drag down the war-fighting side of what we do. We will become heavy, we will become unable to talk to industry, and we will not deliver to America's taxpayers what they deserve in terms of their tax dollars. So I've taken on what Secretary Cohen and I call a revolution in business affairs. And I won't go into all the details, but suffice it to say it is attempting to change entirely the culture of how we do business, to get to much more of what you might call an e-government way of running the Pentagon than the current way we run it. This means, for instance, right now we're fighting hard to get a corporate intranet. Sounds a little wonkish, what are you talking about? But just think of this. We now have our ships pretty well laced together at sea. Yet when those ships send their signals ashore, they fall into basically 160 different computer networks which do not all talk to each other, which make it very hard for the Navy ashore to operate like the modern Chrysler, GM, or Ford is attempting to operate. So we want a corporate intranet. We're getting an enormous amount of resistance from a number of places. Small business community, you're taking away work we currently do. The labor unions, you are taking away jobs potentially. I just met with the labor leaders yesterday and said, we're not taking away jobs, this will make you more productive. But it's interesting to try to reform the Pentagon and find out how many people are opposed to your becoming more efficient. So the final thing I'd say we're doing is trying to make the Navy and the Marine Corps an agile, fleet-footed bureaucracy. Those are hard words to put into one sentence, but we're going to try to be agile and fleet-footed as a bureaucracy. Well, there's more I could say about that. We have started doing housing where we use private capital. We now give our young sailors credit for their Navy training. We've lined up a set of colleges around the country that say, fine, you get credit for going to boot camp, you get credit for going to A school. That's our technical school. And here, by the way, is the school's requirements for the rest of the courses you take to get an AA degree. And here, by the way, is the tuition assistance we'll give you, young sailor, to get that. And here's the distance learning we'll give you so you can do it on a ship. So we have now handed out 200,000 smart transcripts that tell a sailor just what I described. And these young men and women are getting AA degrees as they serve. And I'll come back to why that's so important to America. But it's certainly important to us because we need people who have the ability to think about complex thoughts, to do math and science well. And more we're saying to young sailors and Marines, get your education while you're in the service, not come to the service, get some education benefits, leave the service, and go someplace else to go to college. And they're saying yes. We're doing a lot of other things trying to get rid of painting ships by our crew. Why not hire civilian painters? They happen to be better. They happen to know how to keep it from rusting, which means you only repaint it every 5 years. And suddenly we've relieved our sailors of a burdensome job, said, I trained you to be a radar technician, be a radar technician. Think of what we're competing against. Bill Gates hires a young programmer and he does not say, welcome to Microsoft, and for the first 3 weeks you'll be doing KP duty. For the next 6 weeks you'll be cleaning the heads. And for after that, I'll have you maybe paint the halls. And then, after 6 months, you can be a programmer. He says quite the opposite. You're a professional. I'm going to make you a programmer as soon as you're trained. And by the way, I'm going to give you stock options beside. Well, I got no stock options. I better at least get rid of the crummy work that we used to burden these sailors with. There we are. The Navy, precise, net-centric, three-block war, business revolution. Now let's talk a little bit about globalization. Globalization's very interesting. You've all seen it. I don't need to repeat what's going on. Just look at the number of people on the internet. Right now, we're expecting 1 billion people within 5 years will be on the net. We're expecting $7 trillion of purchasing to go on in terms of e-commerce by 2004. This is essentially changing the way the world operates. Think of how it affects even labor. You'd say, well, labor is a sort of fixed geographical thing. But look what they're doing with software. I start programming it here in Baltimore. End of the day, I satellite it to India. They program all night. End of the day in India, they satellite to Ireland, and they program all day. And by the end of that, they bring it back to the US, and we start again. Well, that's basically business finding labor around the world at the price they want. And if business wanted to do all the programming in India because the price was better, they arguably have the power. So labor now basically moves around the world based on where the markets view them as most valuable. But in addition, it's not all positives. It certainly raises questions. Take, for instance, Steve Case's comment when they announced the Time Warner merger. It says, look, we're going to be in 122 countries. I want to have one standard around the world. I do not want to be regulated by those countries. Well, there goes the nation state as we know it, right? It just says, look, I'll just walk right above you. Listen to the Prime Minister of Malaysia. Basically says he views many global corporations as stronger than mid-sized countries. So you can imagine a world in which global corporate world says we'll create our own rules, spin around the earth on the internet, and basically leave the nation state to ponder its future. Well, that raises some serious questions for us in terms of what our role is in this whole world, which I want to raise a little later. The other thing is, you do get the feeling that global trade, the internet, globalization, leads to a kind of interdependence that's got some hopeful qualities. There certainly are some. You're beginning to see what look like underdeveloped countries beginning to get a quick leap up because they don't have to put copper wire in every place. They don't have to do all the things that we did in order to turn into industrial power. But you also see many evidences that we are getting richer faster than they, that the gap is widening. If that's the case, it sort of brings a fundamental question to what is going on around the world and what's our future going to be like. Right now, think of it, 3 billion people in the world live on $2 a day. That's half the world. 1 billion of those people live on $1 a day. And I've argued that you cannot expect our nation to find itself surrounded by basically sympathetic nations of the world, and predominantly we are, even though we have pockets of hostility, as long as that kind of differentiation and wealth exists. So our role as defenders of the nation is made far more difficult in a world in which that kind of poverty, take your way out to 2020 and 2030 and ask yourself, will the world tolerate 40 years after the end of the Cold War and no progress made on who's wealthy and who's poor? So it seems to me that as we shape the globe, and certainly the Navy shapes the globe, more and more we're going to get asked the question, not only are you stabilizing the world, but are you in some fashion helping the world grow? And who are you aligned with to do that? And my short answer today is, it's amazing the void between those who believe they're developing the world and those of us that believe we are stabilizing the world. Even inside our federal government, the number of the State Department counterpart I have is not a number I know. It's not a phone call that rings from the State Department and says, why don't we have lunch and talk about how we're going to work our way through Indonesia? At the very top of the system, they talk. But in terms of that kind of glue that unites two organizations, it doesn't exist. And without it, it seems to me, we face many problems in the future that we need to get about solving. The other thing is that if you think about our future just as a producer of goods, it's unclear to me how we can continue in a world in which we don't have a thriving global economy that consumes our production and our goods. And so even for what might be viewed as our own direct self-interest, we need those marketplaces, we need those relationships to be built. And I think we're beginning to learn some of that as we see in WTO and our efforts to create a trade pact with China, but there certainly is more to be done in certainly aligning military power and its shaping and deterring function and what goes on with those who promote development. Now, the third thing I want to talk about was this. That's the role that America plays in generating an innovative, vital society. I go out to the Midwest and I spoke to the middle school teachers of Michigan. They were a little surprised I was there, I think, about 500 of them. Why is the Navy here? But the argument I made was this, that the 8th grader that you're teaching today is going to be the admiral or the general of 2030, the one who decides how to read an incoming missile, how to read a negotiating point with a Chinese general. And the child you raise today affects the policy of 2030. In addition, if you raise a child to be innovative, bright, challenged by the world, interested in competing, you create one worldview. If you raise children who are dull and dim and feel they're not able to compete in the world, you're going to raise a set of children who grow up and say, put up the walls and basically block them out. And the consequences, I think, for America are enormous. You can think of the implications. They're not only enormous for America, but they become enormous for the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Marine Corps. Because a world in which we feel we can thrive, in which our workers, our businesses, our small businesses say, sort of, bring it on, we can handle this, is a world in which we'll be engaged in a way that we, in essence, keep stability through our presence, but will not be faced with enormous hostility all the time. But a world in which we've walled off and basically said, we'll dwell within our own wealth, and the rest of you can do what you want, will be a world that becomes more and more hostile, and most likely it will develop at least one player in that world who says our demise is their gain. If that's the case, we'll find ourselves back in replaying a good bit of what felt like the 20th century, in which we find nations committed to our destruction and the enormous burden that imposed on us and the enormous loss in terms of growth of the nation, growth of the world that resulted in. So I've argued to teachers and bankers, businessmen, labor unions, take seriously this question of building an innovative America. Take seriously your role in making us thrive and feel good about competing. You not only produce for us recruits who we can bring in and teach easily, and send to sea and have do great jobs, and that's a real gain for us, but you create a world in which we're willing to compete and take on global competition and feel like we can succeed. You probably can see this already and have probably felt it some in your life, and that is the role we play linked with you in this often is this. You educate bright young men and women. We bring them into the Navy and Marine Corps and give them 4, 8, 12, 20, 30 years of leadership, education, consequence, seeing the world. But they, even at a young age, return to your cities, to Baltimore's, to Chicago's, to Kansas City's, and they return different people. They return people who are confident, are able to lead, who become your leaders, your citizens. So I've argued from the West Coast to the East, we're in this together, linked together in the world we create and the America we create. And the better you do it, the better off I think the Navy and Marine Corps will be in the future. Well, as you ponder these remarks and we talk about it, there's 3 things I have in mind that I'd like you to remember. First is this: the Navy and the Marine Corps are forward deployed, ready to face the challenges ahead. We are ready to project power and influence from the sea. We do it with precision and we do it with the use of knowledge in a way never before done in warfare. Second, globalization is perhaps the challenge of the 21st century. It has great opportunities and great risk. Learning to deal with it and contend with it will be one of the key things we do as leaders in these 20 years in front of us. And third, you and Americans across the nation build, hopefully, a vital, invigorated, innovative society. After all, we did win the Cold War, and it was a great challenge between a free market, free economy, democracy, and a centralized state, and the differences were profound. No matter how hard Soviet leaders might have wanted to win that war, they could not develop the creativity, the innovation, the sense of commitment that freedom and opportunity provides. So that's a mark the world has seen. It's a mark the world recognizes. And so together, if we can build that here and around the world, I think we have great opportunity in the future. And if we fail, I think many will look back on us and say, how could they have lost this opportunity? They won the 20th century, and then they let the 21st century get away from them. So it's a good time to be in the Navy. It's a good time to be in the Marine Corps. We're hiring, incidentally, so send your, I'll take enlistments after the speech. We're pleased to be part of the American team, and I'm pleased to be here tonight. So with that, I'd like to say I'd be glad to answer your questions and talk about anything you'd like to talk about. Thank you.
I'll make no comments about recruitment policy here. Well, thanks very much for what was really a stimulating and very interesting presentation. Yes, sir. Well, the question is, how effective is top-down management? And would you comment on the assertion that naval bureaucratic methods of 6 years ago were seriously deficient? Have they changed?
Well, it's a tough question. I'd say probably from your point of view, probably hasn't changed a lot. There's two issues going on, maybe three. One is we overall feel we're out of money. Defense Department may have $300 billion, but I assure you, if you sat down with the Joint Chiefs and asked them, if you asked me off the record, the numbers would approach 50 to 100 billion more that the building believes it needs in order to do what it's being asked to do. So with money that dear, you begin to look greatly at priorities. And while you can try to set a lot of priorities from a bottom-up position, that is, tell us what you think we really ought to do, you in the end make a number of your priority decisions from a top-down view, which is, we think there are these things we need to accomplish. So I'd say it's in the nature of bureaucracy to make a fair number of top-down decisions, and we probably still do. Now, basic research is interesting. This sort of underlying presumption on basic research is you can't tell what are the best things to do. So there, you try to be as wide open as you can about what the territory will cover, and you put a piece of your money on that and say, you know, I trust to the future, in that will be great insights. And in the past, that's proven true, and we do that now. As we move up the ladder of more focused money, we now begin to say more, we need it to solve a problem we face. But there are other changes. We've recognized, for instance, that a good bit of what we might call development in America, especially, and some of the research is being done essentially in the venture capital businesses. Those young businesses founded with venture capital money are doing what we used to do in the D part of R&D. So why not buy it from them? There's many companies now that are doing great research. Buy it from them. So we're trying to be savvy about where the best place to get it from is, to cover the key issues we need to cover. And we run the risk in many ways, being good stewards of the money, that others could say, but you ignored this opportunity over here that just could have been a gold mine. And I can name some things that would intrigue me. There's, related to energy, which I might very much like to be involved in, because if I can solve them, I solve a conundrum for the Chinese, And if I solve a conundrum for the Chinese, I make life likely easier for all of us. Hard to get in a defense budget today.
Comment on the connection between brightness and wisdom.
Yeah. Well, see, it's an interesting, I mean, I'm a political science graduate of Ohio State, a Yale-trained lawyer, which means I didn't learn to be a lawyer at Yale. I learned that someplace else. So, and I'm going off to be the dean of management of technology soon. My whole life's been lived much more on the side you're describing than on the whiz kid side. No, my thought actually was it isn't only, in my view, it isn't only the whiz kid part or the high scientific part that makes America thrive. It's the fact that we have this innovative, creative, complete society. And a lot of the innovation doesn't take place on the, it takes place, I'd say, on the more literary, more humanistic side of life. Plus, a lot of what we got to understand about the future, whether I just take the issue of warfare, is got less to do, not only has to do with these issues of making a missile hit precisely where I want, that's the scientific issues, but the question of what topples a government, what ends a regime's willingness to fight. Ask yourself that about Kosovo. Can you name what we did that caused Milosevic to say, I'm done? That seems to me the essence of warfare, is to understand how do you get a leader to say, I quit? And that's a very humanistic question, not just a scientific question. So but broaden it out to the whole of the nation. I'm not proposing we all become engineers at all. If anything, it'd be the opposite, that we become humanists with an engineering set of skills. So I think I'm with you. And if you think I'm generating the wrong solution, I'll pay some attention to that. But.
The question is, does the Navy get its fair share, or does it get enough? And then secondly, will a 100-ship Navy 10 years from now be sufficient?
Let me take the second one first, and I'll go to the larger question. We're building ships at about an 8 ships a year rate. That does not quite sustain the current levels, which incidentally are higher than 300. They're at 320, in that range. But in general, I said, the budget's a problem. We have more to do than we have money to accomplish it. And the pressures right now to potentially take a ship out of the budget and replace it with aircraft. Need aircraft too. Or let's say take it out of the budget to pay recruiting costs, pay bill increases. We need to increase pay because they don't get paid enough. The tensions between pay, planes, ships are enormous. And you see that tension played out. And I could want to have 300 ships as much as possible, and all I'll do is have the air side of the Navy on me is, why don't we have enough aircraft? And if I do both of those, I'll have the humanist side of the Navy on me. Why don't we pay our sailors enough, and why are so many on food stamps? So trying to make that budget balance is a real problem. And you see the tension. We're holding very close to 300 ships. Would we like more money? Yes. Now, money between the services, always a touchy subject. I do not want to declare create a range war between the 3 services on money. So do we go out and essentially poach for each other's money? As a rule, no. And if you do it the dark of night. But one of the reasons why I've been going out around America to talk to school teachers and bankers and Wall Street is to get Main Street and Wall Street to recognize the enormous gains they get from a strong Navy and Marine Corps. I mean, take the Navy out of Southeast Asia, I mean, all the ways out, and replay the Indonesia, Southeast Asian economy fall the last 2 years. Now ask, where's your 401k? Where's the Asian economy? Because you probably got 20% of your 401k in global stocks, and a good bit of them were in the Southeast Asian market. Your 401k in Kansas City, in Main Street America, is up or down based on how well the Navy does in stabilizing the world. If I can get that message, if we can get that message across to all of America, then I think congressmen will, of their sort of just innate wisdom, understand that we need more money for the Navy and the Marine Corps. And so therefore, our goal has been articulate the best case to the nation and let the chips fall where they may. I think the chips will fall with the Navy and the Marine Corps.
Would you comment upon how our allies integrate with our Navy?
Well, you probably can use Kosovo as a good way to kind of define the issues. Being able to build an alliance is extremely important. We have really committed even more so that we always need to fight as an alliance. It doesn't matter how good-willed we may be, and I think we're quite good-willed about what we're trying to do around the world. Your heaviness, your strength, your size will be viewed as onerous. And probably you're losing something in terms of understanding the nuances of all that's going on because you have no one beside you who's closer to the scene. So allies, I think, are real important. We've clearly found a problem. That is, we are very technologically strong, and we move up and up the ladder, and their ability to stay even with us is very difficult. You would think we could use this technology to do the kind of translators, the plugs, which might plug the two together. I mean, right? I can send you the essence of what you need to know, and you can operate side by side with me. Maybe we'll get there. We have committed now on every major weapon system we build, it has to have interoperability with our allies as part of its capacity. This will make things actually more complex because they have smaller budgets and are unable to buy all that we buy. So we're committed to it. It's hard to do. How do they stand? Well, you look at the numbers in Kosovo, and we've got about 85% of the war is ours. And then you look, I think right after that comes Canada, and right after that comes Britain, and pretty soon you're saying everyone played a role, but not that big a role. So it's hard for them to keep up. Now we do, I forget the count, but we must do 200 exercises a year around the world, and these are great ways to build capacity with allies because there's not only electronic interoperability, there's also cultural interoperability. And there you can build a lot of that without a lot of dollars. I know you, I trust you, I've had dinner with you, you know my family, you came to the United States, I went to France, whatever. Those can be quite profound. Interestingly, it's stunning how little money is being given to us to do the kind of international understanding building that we used to get. Used to be midshipmen came to the academy predominantly on our nickel from other countries around the world. Well, they got a free ride, granted, but think of the advantage you've got when a 20-year-old educated here is now the admiral of the Navy 30 years from now, and you and he went to school together. And we can name times when that is the reason why we got through already horrendous problems. When we shot inadvertently the Turkish ship 10 years ago, turned out the admiral assigned and the general assigned by Turkey, admiral assigned by us, general assigned by Turkey, had been classmates in school and knew each other. Think the result was different? Yes. So I'd say we are being very short in our view of the world to take away these programs, and I can name any number of them that don't exist right now, and they need to be replaced.
The question is, would you comment on recruitment quotas, meaning how many people a year? Yes.
Yeah. We have to recruit in the Navy about 55,000 young men and women each year, and the Marine Corps about 40,000. As a rule, there's about 4 million young men and women in each year's cohort. So we need that percentage of them to say yes. The total armed services number is about 200,000. So you can see about 5%. Competition continues to grow. The economy is strong. Community colleges are a great alternative. Student loans are widely available. Scholarships are available to some. So we view this as more and more difficult environment to work in. We've hit our quotas in the Marine Corps for 58 months, nearly now crossing that mark. In the Navy, about 15 months, but I think, I saw the numbers, I think in April we missed. If we didn't, we were just within an eyelash. we've doubled the number of recruiters almost. We have increased greatly the amount of money we pay for college benefits. And it's going to be tough from here on out. That's why we're working hard on this program of saying get rid of painting ships, get rid of doing all this basically menial work, which has got nothing to do with being a professional in the Navy. We are trying to change this new ship we're building, the DD-21. Because we bring the crew down to 100, means we've got a lot of space. Well, we can now put 4-person staterooms for enlisted people on that ship. It's a hell of a different life than you and I that sailed on a rack with a locker, remember, from a ship. That may get us to the point where a young man or woman would say, you know, a 6-month deployment's reasonable to do. This is tough. I really worry we will build a strategic concept of naval power around the globe. It's profound. We'll build a set of ships and planes to execute it. It's profound. And we won't be able to recruit the people to go do it. And that would be a shame for the nation, and it's why we're working so hard on what we call the people issues. Just one other point, I recruited the former Secretary of the Navy under the Bush administration, Sean O'Keefe, to lead our task force on people issues out to 2020. And said, Sean, I need a solution which is bipartisan, which whether Bush or Gore gets elected will be accepted, that gets to these questions. And Sean agreed to do it, and together we're building a picture of the future that hopefully solves some of these problems. This is the toughest thing we faced. It'd be hard to build some of the scientific part, but we can do it, and we've got capacity to do it. Recruiting young men and women, really tough.
Would you comment on women in submarines?
Well, I mean, I'm a product of the 60s in which it's men and men only, and so I'm sometimes amazed and still quite surprised to find myself on a ship and see that 20% of the crew, as a rule, is women. We seem to be doing this fabulously well overall. We learned some things. One is you got to have some senior leadership, so there's got to be some chiefs that are women. There got to be some officers that are women. If you just put young enlisted women on a ship, it is not going to be a good thing. And so we've learned now how to build a ship well with women on board, and we fight it well and sail it well. And in general, you look at most of the statistics, pregnancy is obviously higher with women. But on the other hand, we see about as many physical injuries percentage-wise with men. So when you sort of look at the, quote, disability factor, men's rambunctiousness, you might call it, leads to a certain number of injuries that women don't seem to get. So overall, we felt pretty successful. The submarine issue, you saw the Secretary about 6 months ago say, time to think about it. You're talking about losing some of the best brain power in America by not having women on submarines. You can think of other reasons why you might want women on submarines. It's a small craft. If women are ordinarily a little smaller, but other than that, all work better. You can think of some reasons why it doesn't work. The submarine community wasn't real pleased with the discussion, and sort of there's been a lot of resistance, although interestingly, the most resistance is people my age, the older generations, who sort of just view the whole issue of the relation of the sexes in a different way than a lot of these young men and women do. And I don't deny hormones don't exist, but they do view it differently. So it's really not a big debate in the fleet, not a big issue. In fact, I've talked to submarine chiefs who said, if that's the way you want it to be, we'll do it. Now, they might say, I'd just as well not do it because there's some things that are easier, but they said, that's what you want, we'll do it. So could it happen? Yes, I think it could. Are we ready? No, not yet. But the discussion's a good one. And you just saw us put women on mine sweeps. That's, from all reports, gone well, and that's really, the submarines will remain the only ships that we haven't got, boats, we could say, that don't have women on them.
Would you comment on burden sharing?
Yeah. The precision is expensive, although I think as we see this future where recruiting is very expensive, you may begin to conclude that precision is less expensive because you can accomplish it with such lower manning levels. terms of burden sharing, we're engaged in it across the world. But if you look at our budget, you take the next 5 navies of the world and they don't add up to our naval budget. So percentage-wise, we're carrying an enormous part of the load. We do exercises to bring out that capacity. We do joint technology development to get this cooperative relationship. But it's been surprisingly tough. We have great confidence in American technology, and the military in general, and I'm talking now about uniform leadership, wants to buy, most of the time, American goods. And so when we try to do a joint program, it's sort of, why are we out there taking risk with someone else's technology when we could use our best? So there's been a real tension in the system about wanting to do it, and you can feel the cost of trying to reach out. You saw the Secretary of Defense and all of us do a major reform in technology transfer. We just got a new bargain with the State Department, I think yesterday, I'm not sure we made it public, in which we are going to open up our technology transfer to nations which will protect our secrets. All of that will lead to better burden sharing. Europe's growth may be a plus in this. Certainly Australia, Japan, Singapore, Saudi Arabia, the Middle East, put major amounts of money into our defense costs. Look at Japan's contribution to our forces in the Far East. So there are a lot of places that do share the burden. Could there be more? Yes. Part of that may be for all of us to develop a concept of what we're doing in the world, which not only appears to satisfy our interests, but their interests. And that's why I laid out in the beginning the idea that we think about shaping that's not only stability, our interests, but growth, our and their interests. And it seemed to me at that point they say the utility of this is much higher, get them engaged. But anyone that has a relationship overseas, I would encourage them to say, let's think of this new world and what we're trying to build and get engaged with us. We're ready to do it.
Mr. Secretary, we've
wrapped this up, right?
We've covered a lot of ground, and it's been very concise, and I think you've provided us with a wonderful picture of the thinking within the Navy today. We appreciate that, and we appreciate the time you've shared with us. Thanks so much.